Good morning, Rian Kutse, Fortis Proactive Defense Solutions. I'm back talking to Walter Meyer, Wild Medics. Walt, good morning and welcome.
Morning, Rayan. Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, today we're going to be talking about trauma care in remote or hostile environments. Well, I'm just going to kick off with this one. There must be some unique challenges to this type of treatment in those type of environments or circumstances. What would you say they are?
Yeah, Rayan, I think it will obviously change depending on what exactly the circumstances are that one is talking about. But there are some things in general about those sort of situations. The one is a lack of resources, right? So minimal equipment, or you might have equipment, but it might not be the equipment you want. Or you have to use improvised equipment, which is maybe not ideal. Or you may have to even build equipment, such as a stretcher or something like that, in order to get done what needs to be done. That's the one thing. When the other thing, of course, is the evacuation becomes an issue. So the time that you have to look after the patient is extended, which is a whole field on its own. If you're stuck in that situation, most of the first aid courses and things that people attend, they look at 20, 30 minutes of patient care. If you're suddenly looking at multiple days or even multiple hours, but multiple days or weeks or something of patient care, that changes the story completely in terms of knowledge. But then also your evacuations issues. So your evacuation plan as part of your first aid skills, how to make a plan, how to execute the evacuation, and so on. And of course, that can be not only prolonged, it can be made very difficult by the terrain, the weather, or like if you mentioned a hostile type of environment. So if I guess that's almost the worst case scenario.
Yeah.
When you still need to be careful of not getting killed in the process. Yeah. And you have to make a plan. And of course, the rescuers and so on are also exposed to tremendous risk. In the city environment, we often think that the first aider or the rescuer is there after the thing happened. So they're normally, reasonably safe, I would say, depending on obviously what's going on. But in a wilderness environment or a hostile environment, the rescuers or the first aider is also at risk. And it changes that game, and it changes the skills you may need to get the person to where you need to get them.
Okay. Tourniquets. Such a inconsequential looking piece of kit, but such a life-saving piece of kit, and such a vital part of any person's medical equipment. What do you propose for the correct application and duration when you use a tourniquet, especially in the circumstances we're talking about?
Yeah, you see, it's an interesting piece of equipment because where it's normally discussed is only up to the point of, okay, now I've got the bleeding under control. And if you look at the training that most people have in that is, it's fairly basic. If you do, maybe you cover it on a first aid course, or you cover it in a stop the bleed course or something. But most of those courses, once again, are designed for the urban environment. So if you look at the standard stop the bleed syllabus, for instance, it doesn't include removal of the tourniquet. It only includes application. So it's application and go to hospital, which is obviously, that's great if you can do that, because then it's not your problem. The application is actually the easy part. It's like with a lot of things, the actual skill of putting it there is easy. It's understanding what you've done now, and what you do further becomes an issue. Now with tourniquets, the initial placing, you can train that. That's fairly easy. Most people understand that. Okay, get it on. Now it's on. Now I've got the bleeding under control. If you're now in a remote setting, or you're in a hostile setting or something where you are delayed, And keep in mind, remote setting in this case could be something like a far off farm or something like that. So it doesn't have to be this, completely rugged wilderness. You know what I mean? It could just be. It's when you talk about remote, it's literally at basics, it's about time. So the normal recommendation with a tourniquet placement is that you apply it, and then you have to get the patient to a hospital facility within 2 hours after application. Okay. But now when you're looking at long-term care, your problem is that after 2 hours that the person has this tourniquet on, you may start seeing some issues develop. Or how would I put it? You're not going to see those issues develop necessarily. What will happen, obviously, the patient will have a lot of pain from the tourniquet. The arm will be numb. They may have severe pins and needles, all kinds of things that can happen, right? The patient may even try and pull this thing off on their own because it's so painful. The problem that happens is, in simple terms, is that you have a toxic buildup that starts within that limb, okay, within the arm or the leg that's been tourniqueted. The same thing would happen if you are entrapped. Okay, so if whatever, you roll your car there and you fall out the window and the car ends up on your leg there, whatever, in the middle of a dust road in the Karoo somewhere, and now you're lying there with a car on your leg for 10 hours. You've got a similar problem that develops, or if you fall and you hang in a harness cuts off your supply, you've got it's all similar type problems what happens. So what happens is you've got a toxic buildup in that limb. And at a certain point, if you release that instantly, the body cannot deal with that toxic overload that will flow back into the body. Okay. And that can shut you down. It can kill you fairly instantly. And the longer that period is, the more it's something that you cannot do in the field anymore. It's something that now has to be done in hospital, the removal. You need pharmaceuticals, you need all kinds of things to deal with this. You need to be able to support the filtering organs. All right, so it becomes more complicated the longer you wait. So important skill actually for people to learn is tourniquet conversion. So what that means is I've applied a tourniquet and now things are calm, the situation's under control. Okay, now what do I do? And you can now remove or replace the tourniquet by, how would I put it? You want to replace your bleeding control, right? So let's say I've got the tourniquet on my arm, I've got the wound on my arm. It gives you that opportunity, if you wanted, you could now even clean the wound or whatever, because it's under control. Then I would have to pack that wound. Okay. Now, the best thing there would be is if you have a chemical hemostat of some sort, you pack it with a chemical hemostat. So that is something like Celox or one of those types of products, right? And you pack it with that, and you pressure bandage it properly. The nice thing about that situation now is, because it's calm, you can take a few minutes, and pressure bandage it correctly. You're not under that high stress of, I'm pressure bandaging because I need to control the bleeding. All right, the bleeding's under control by the tourniquet, you can pressure bandage it. And then what you do is, now there are a whole bunch of techniques, and some people will say, oh no, but you now have to put a fresh tourniquet around because the old one is now being used, so it's now a second use of a tourniquet. Anyway, that's a long story, okay? But in basics, if I have a one tourniquet, once I've got that wound packaged and I've got a pressure bandage, I can release the tourniquet, all right? Now people will say to you, oh, you have to release it slowly and so on, but an actual windlass tourniquet, it doesn't release in increments. It tends to be kind of on or off. It's, there's a margin there where there's a little gap, but it's basically on or off. So you loosen this thing, and then what you do is you keep it in place but loose. So it sits there in the same place. The reason for that is I want to be able to retighten it if this bandage is not controlling the bleeding. Okay. And then I need to observe this wound now to see if the blood starts coming out through this dressing, through the hemostat, maybe the hemostat's failing, maybe the pressure bandaging is failing, whatever. I need to be able to observe it, and I need to be able to look at my condition of my patient. Now, this is a very brief kind of a summary, right? It's better for people to understand that watching that now is not considered training, right? You need to really understand what it is. But what you've done now is you've changed the tourniquet to a dressing and packaging, which should restore your circulation. Now, although the bandage will impair the circulation, it's hopefully not cutting off the circulation completely, right? And then, like the tourniquet was doing, the tourniquet was cutting it off, and you should now get perfusion back in that limb. And you have the option of retightening the tourniquet in case of need. And the tourniquet also stays in place. So when you have a patient at hospital, if you leave a patient there, then they know that there was a tourniquet used on this patient, and they need to take precautions to make sure the tourniquet didn't damage the patient. Right? There are things to consider there, and that is if the patient's in shock, you cannot really do this. Okay, so if especially the further the shock is progressed, right? So if this patient is compensating, so they've got a increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, maybe they're pale, etc. So they're showing signs of shock. You stop that because you applied the tourniquet. If you now release the tourniquet and in that process you spill another 50 mils of blood or something, that may just be enough to push this guy into decompensation, right? So you have to be really careful. So one of the things that kind of exclude that is if the patient's in shock. There's also the issues if let's say the patient is combative, so the patient wants to fight with you because of confusion, etc. They've got a decreased level of consciousness, which are all actually signs of shock. You cannot necessarily do that. Okay, you cannot necessarily convert. And then you have the issue that the patient needs to be observed after that. Okay, or you need to at least be in a position where, let's say you're driving and he can sit next to you. But if you're driving and he's lying on the back of a bakkie, that's a hell of a risky proposition, right? Because if that thing starts bleeding and you can't observe it, then you've got a problem. So there are limitations to that, and kind of a few rules to follow in terms of that. The problem is that if you have a tourniquet on beyond 6 hours, okay, you start looking at the possibility of loss of limb, okay? So the closer you get to 6 hours, the more difficult and risky it becomes to convert as well. So if you want to convert, it's almost something you want to do in the early stages. You'll see different recommendations in different books and so forth. But most will say to you, look, you want to do it in the first 2 hours, you want to convert, okay? Hopefully the situation is such that the situation doesn't carry on for longer than 2 hours and you can't convert. But anyway, situations, we can talk about a million things, and so ideally you want to convert within in that sort of 2 hour period, and then you'll beyond 6 you've got a big problem. Beyond 6 you really want to rather leave it on. Now I will say I've read some papers where they've had guys who had tourniquets on for beyond 9 hours. And they made full recoveries. The limbs were not lost. They didn't lose any function, anything like that. But also circumstances, and there are things that play a role in that. So not everybody's going to react the same to it. But anyway, the skill of tourniquet conversion is quite important. You'll see there, you often find on social media, and some you'll have guys make these posts about never remove a tourniquet and blah, 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 but it's lack of knowledge, and it's very, simplistic looking at things, and it's assuming everything is happening in a city and you're 10 minutes from the hospital and that sort of thing. So it's an important skill, especially for people who live more remotely. So it's something that I include, for instance, in the Stop the Bleed training that we do, is to teach people about that, because a lot of my clients actually do live remotely. If I think about the guys who come and Stop the Bleed courses, very often they're from farms and game lodges and places like that, and they're hours away from help, so they need a bit more knowledge.
They need to be better prepared.
Yeah.
What are common mistakes that you have picked up over time, or you see often that people make when it comes to bleeding control, techniques of bleeding control under stress?
I think the one is probably not acting fast enough, especially if it's serious bleeding. You have to act really fast. You don't have so much time to think about it. You need to be able to recognize the need for the serious bleeding control and get going with it as soon as possible. One of the mistakes I make there is not practicing enough, and I'm not suggesting necessarily attending a training course every week. It's you can practice at home. You can teach your friends and family or whatever, and that's a way of refreshing your knowledge. There are simple ways of practicing these things. You'll see with tourniquets, for instance, lots of guys will buy tourniquets and they won't get a practice one. And you really do need a training version, which is at least the benefit of these knockoff cheapy things that you can buy online. At least you can use them for training, so they've got some sort of use. I wouldn't put them in my first aid kit, but they, for training or for teaching your kids or whatever, you can buy $100 knockoff, and teach the kids with that. But anyway,
I know by now that those cheap ones are one of your pet hates.
Yeah, they're risky, and I think that's the biggest issue, is that they're risky. But anyway, and then the other mistakes that you see people physically make is they almost try and be. It's funny now. My first comment was you need to act fast, but my third comment now will be is you need to still be able to do the skill correctly. It doesn't help you try and be so fast that you actually mess everything up. Some people get so almost hysterical, and you even see we see this on training courses a lot, that especially when it's the more realistic training with the simulations and so on, people will get so caught up in it that they'll drop equipment, or they'll put a tourniquet on upside down, or they'll tighten the strap of a tourniquet, forgot to turn the windlass. All these things happen, and this is actually what is quite important with training, is to make mistakes in the training so that you learn from them. You'll see it's, I never publish a thing that will say, my students were all perfect today, because I actually don't want them to be perfect. I want them to mess up, it's because it happens for real. And I mean, I've been doing this stuff for a very, very long time, and I will still mess up. And after every patient, you'll say to yourself, I could have done that better, or I could have done that sequence better, or whatever it is, or I should have forgot to do that. I should have done that. So it's with the tourniquet specifically, it's upside down. Actually, it happens. You won't believe it, but the guy puts the thing in place, he straps it down, and then the windlass sits against the person's leg. They don't twist the windlass. The other thing with the tourniquets that happen is they will forget to lock it out completely. So, for instance, on your cat style tourniquet with the Velcro, there's normally that little strap that goes over the windlass. They don't put the little Velcro strap on. Now, okay, that per se is not a huge issue if you've applied it correctly, but it does mean that thing can pop out at any moment. If it pops out, it's done. The guy's going to bleed again. It's that sort of thing. So just finishing the job. Then with chemical hemostats and packing gauzes and so on, non-chemical hemostats, you get this situation where people forget that they have to apply pressure to it. So they'll shove it in the wound and then just carry on. Okay, you can't do that because the thing doesn't act alone. It requires pressure for quite a while before it works. So if you pack a wound with a non-chemical product, you're probably looking at 20 minutes or more of hard direct pressure on that wound for it to stop. So once you've packed it, you're going to engage your hands and you're going to be stuck there, okay, unless you can find some other way to apply pressure. Like a pressure bandage, which may work, but it depends where on the person's body it is. Some places it's very difficult to pressure bandage in certain positions and in certain injuries, And then your chemical hemostats, you need to apply pressure for at least 2 to 3 minutes before you then bandage them or whatever before you can kind of move on to something else. So you get stuck in there. So people forget that, and with bleeding control as well. Yeah, so that's probably the most common mistakes I see.
So at which point do I bring in my array of bleed stopping tampons?
Yeah, no. When you yeah, no, let me not comment on that. But yeah, please, it's yeah, rather leave those things for their original application.
Walt, penetrating chest wounds, abdominal injuries, limited resources. How would you describe the management of those types of wounds under those circumstances?
Right. So, yeah, when we have a penetrating injury, it changes the game a bit on the chest and the abdomen. It's very difficult to control serious bleeding from either area. So if you have a penetrating chest injury with severe bleeding, chances of that patient surviving that is really small, and there's very little you can do about it, outside a hospital setting. So yeah, the only chance of that type of thing would be taking the patient immediately to a hospital. If you're far away from a hospital, you've got no chance. Even I think realistically, with severe bleeding from the chest, the actual chance is super minimal of survival, because even if you were right next to a hospital, I don't think any of the doctors can act fast enough. But okay, you've got a chance in theory, okay, depending on the situation. So generally, your chest injuries don't bleed so severely. That is, unless it hits the heart or one of the big vessels. Okay. So you cannot put direct pressure on the chest. Now, for the people, please, we're talking about a penetration. That means something that's gone right in to the chest. It's not a superficial thing like a cut on the outside of the ribs or whatever. That you can put pressure on, or pack it with material or whatever you need to do. But a penetration you cannot pack on the chest. You cannot put pressure on it. But there are other things when bleeding that one has to be concerned about. On the abdomen with bleeding, you can put direct pressure on there. In other words, your hands, and push it in there, push a knee in there. It will slow it down a bit. But it's not necessarily going to stop it, but you do have some chance of controlling the bleeding. On the chest, you've got really close to zero chance of controlling severe bleeding. Anyway, so one of the issues, and I think this is more the one we want to talk about, that is what happens when there is a sucking chest wound, which is the proper name for it is an open pneumothorax. So that is where there's a hole in the chest, or keep in mind, the hole where you see the hole is not necessarily the issue. It's where the channel goes. In other words, you can have an external injury on let's say that's visible on the abdomen, but it actually penetrates through into the chest cavity, right? Because it's about where the wound channel goes. So what happens there is, if you think about when you sit here breathing, you don't have to think about breathing, right? And you don't have to use the muscles to breathe. You don't sit here going, drawing the air in. The air flows in and out naturally. And the way that is done is the body's got the diaphragm that moves, right? And then when the diaphragm moves downwards, the area in the chest expands, which gives you space. And it changes the pressure, and that makes the air flow in through your nose and your mouth. Diaphragm comes back up, squeezes the air out. Right? That's your system. So if you now have a hole in the chest through the chest wall, and please remember the chest wall it's right around. Okay, so it's the back of your chest or the side of your chest. It's not just this front part. People tend to think this is my chest, this is my side, and that's my back. It's all part of your chest, right? If you have a hole in there, when that diaphragm moves down, the air sucks through that hole. It literally flows in through the chest wall into the what's called the pleural space, right, into the chest cavity. And you have a situation where the lung starts doing this Okay, and where that air gets caught there, so as the diaphragm goes down, it sucks the air in, the lung starts collapsing slowly. Okay. When you breathe out, some of that air will escape out, but some will stay behind. In other words, every breath, that problem gets a little worse and a little worse and a little worse.
Yes.
Of course, the harder, the faster you're breathing, the quicker that thing's going to develop, right? You may also have an issue that whatever injured you may have also injured the lung. So you may now have a situation where the lung is leaking air into the cavity, as well as the air sucking through the chest wall. So it can be more complicated. Then you can have a situation where you now have bleeding on the inside that adds to that, etc., etc. Anyway, so what you want to do is you want to firstly stop air from entering into the chest cavity through that hole in the chest wall, right? So you need to seal that. Now, if you're right around the corner from the hospital or something, you can just stick anything on there that will seal it. You could put an AED pad on there. You could put a Tegaderm on there. You can put anything that seals it on there. Okay. If you're a little further away, one of the issues is that you would prefer to have something that's vented. In other words, that's like a one-way valve. So if you purchase a chest seal, you generally get two types. You get the vented and you get the non-vented one. So the non-vented one is essentially just a piece of plastic with glue on it. It's a big sticker, basically, and you stick that on, and that seals the hole. That stops air from being pulled into the chest. The problem now is if you have that secondary injury where the penetration also injured the lung, you now have a situation where the lung is leaking air into the chest. So you've turned the open pneumothorax into a closed pneumothorax. Right? So then there's nowhere for that air to go. And as a first aider, you're probably not trained or equipped to decompress the chest, and now you're stuck in a situation, right? So we prefer generally a vented chest seal, so something with a valve. It's also not just for it means the air that's trapped inside can escape. So if that lung starts functioning again, starts standing up again, then it can push that air out through the valve. Also, if there's blood or something that wants to run out, or the guy coughs out blood through there, then that whole or the vent lets that stuff out, okay, because it has no benefit being in the body, you want it out. So that's the idea with a vented chest seal. Now, they're all, if you read articles and things about this, there's a lot of arguments. Some say it makes no difference to have a vent, and some say you need the vent. Okay, we were certainly, in my life, we were always taught to have a vent, and there's a way of dealing with it, without a chest seal. You can take something like a plastic bag. Okay, this is really tiny. It's lying here on my desk. Okay, you can take something like a little plastic bag, something like a Ziploc bag. That type of thickness works quite well. You can also cut this open, right, so that it's a sheet of plastic. It's no longer a bag. So take your scissors, cut it, and then you apply it onto the patient over the wound, and you tape it around 3 of the edges. So you leave a gap there. And then what happens is, as the patient breathes in, the plastic sucks into the hole, and it stops that air from going in. If they breathe out, the plastic lets go, and there's a little gap for fluid to come out or for air to escape through, right? So you basically create that one-way valve kind of situation. Once again, please, this is for interested people. You need to actually learn how to do the stuff in practice and so on. So please don't see this as a full course. It's a discussion about it.
Please don't.
Yeah, and then you need to also learn how to manage that thing, because the chest seal also needs to be managed, especially if you are in a longer term care situation. You may need to do things like replace the chest seal, burp the wound, and so forth and so forth. So that's all kinds of things that you need to learn, because ideally you want to keep that open. For instance, if the wound closes up from coagulation or whatever, so from blood clotting, then you may have a situation where you now have a closed pneumothorax. That open pneumothorax is easier to manage for a first aider. So if you can keep it open, it's actually better. And then with a valve on to stop air from going in, if that makes sense. So that's in short what you would do with that. And yeah, then of course you want to get that person to hospital as soon as possible.
Of course, yes. So, if you're talking about amputations, I mean, this gets serious, or just a very severely injured limb, what would you say are the key steps, well, once it's been done, for whatever reason? Maybe it was an amputation that happened in an accident. You have to take care of that stump. You have to manage that stump for, bleeding and infection, etc. What would you say are the key steps for this?
Look, the first thing with amputation is obviously stop the bleed. You need to apply tourniquet. Generally, that would be the best way to control the bleeding. Keep in mind that in some cases with an amputation, especially blast injuries and so on, you may have a situation where the veins and arteries contract a bit, so they pull in other words, because they're a little elastic, right? So from that impact, they may pull up. So if you put the tourniquet right on the edge of the stump, you sometimes have a problem that you basically are now below where the bleeding sits. So you need to be slightly higher. Okay, so generally a handwidth or a bit more above the actual edge of the amputation. And then, of course, you need to look that you are successful with your bleeding control. If you apply the tourniquet and you now have severe swelling above the tourniquet, then you know you need to be higher, actually, right? But you'd rather avoid that and go high enough from the start. So that's the one thing. Then the actual stump, that's obviously that's the part that's still attached to the person, right? But that part you want to keep clean. It's like any wound care thing. If you're close to hospital, and when I say close, in even a day or so away from hospital, moderate cleaning and so forth is fine. You might not even have to clean it depending on how the amputation happened. But infection becomes an issue generally when you're dealing with a patient for more than 3 days. Okay, so with any wound, it's not just with an amputation. Obviously, amputation, what makes it quite bad is that there's generally now exposed bone or bone ends. Anytime you have an exposed bone, it could be from a fracture, it doesn't have to be an amputation, but anytime you have an exposed bone ends, you've got an issue with or an increased issue with infection and so forth. So the rule of infection is wash. So it's they say the solution to pollution is dilution. Okay, so throw water and throw water and throw water. So pour more and more and more water on it. If you're in a situation where you don't have things like saline and sterile water and whatever, the rule is generally as long as the water is good enough to drink, you can use that for cleaning wounds. You don't necessarily need antiseptic and so forth. At first, obviously, that sort of stuff helps if you have it, but you don't need it right away. It's water, water, water. And then also the other thing is don't underestimate the power of good old soap. So if you only have soap, then you use soap. So soap and water, and wash it out, and then you need to wrap that end of the stump. Now there are bandages that that come with big pads and so forth that's useful for that situation, but you can do anything. You could wrap it with a shirt and a bandage or whatever if you need to. Not everybody carries those big. It's kind of a specialized thing to have a stump bandage. Then the thing that people often forget is the other part now of the amputation. Okay, so the part that's now loose from the patient, what do you do with that? So the general rule of that, as well as keep it clean, I would wrap the end of kind of the raw part. I would wrap it and then put it, ideally you want to put it in a plastic bag and try and keep it cool, okay, and move it with the patient to the hospital. Obviously, but there are so many factors that influence the chance of success for reattachment, et cetera, whatever. It's kind of going to depend on the situation, but that is what you do. also, I think ethically, if you can, you don't want to just leave body parts lying around the bush somewhere. So take it with you, even if you think it's not going to be reattached. But anyway, it's also that is kind of amazing if you see some of the things that they manage to reattach and fix. So take it with. But that's kind of the basics. It's not very different to any other sort of wound care. I think you've got to keep in mind your patient care where it's going to be different, because the patient that's they're going to be in shock. They're going to need additional shock care and so forth, which is that's different to a simple wound. But as far as the wound care is concerned, very much the same principles.
Okay. Well, I think I'm going to call this one at that point. Just for the viewers, as always, please like the video. Please subscribe to the channel. Please smash that bell icon so you can get notifications of newer videos coming out. And I'll be displaying Wild Medics' contact details on the video for the duration. So if you or your team or your colleagues need either further training or need training in general when it comes to anything medical related, like we've been discussing, please contact Volt and set it up. You will definitely not be sorry. And I mean, as you've been able to realize, I hope from this video, that it's not meant to be a training video. The idea is to discuss these things in an informational manner and make you realize that you actually need more training, as always. Well, that's it from me.
Thank you, Riaan. I appreciate you and appreciate being here.
Cheers. Enjoy the rest of your day. Talk soon. Bye.
Yes.